Hi, I'm James from Authentic Wine and Spirits, and today we're going to talk about the difference between Scottish grain whiskey and Scottish malt whiskey. Now, of course, all whiskey traditionally is made essentially with a mix of grain and water, but grain, the most of the material in grain is made up of starch, which cannot be fermented into beer and then distilled into whiskey. So historically, the easiest way to convert the starch in the grain into sugar was through a process called malting, and that's where the word Scotch malt comes from. So how they would do this is they would take the grain, get it wet, and actually lay it out and let it sprout, and that would cause that conversion. Now, of course, this process is very rudimentary and not very efficient, but when you make whiskey that way and malt the barley, you do get a lot of extra flavor. So typically that malted barley would then be used to make a beer and distilled in a copper pot still, which again is essentially just a big pot and uses up a lot of energy and has very low yields, relatively speaking. So the big innovation that came in the late 1800s was the invention of the continuous still. So this changed everything. No longer did you have to malt barley, which takes a long time and is expensive and laborious, and then put it through a slow process of distillation batch by batch in a pot still. Instead, this new invention of the continuous still allowed you to essentially start the still, pour in beer from the top, and just have it work continuously with alcohol coming out the other end. Now, this dramatically was more efficient and much less expensive to create whiskey. However, the big difference is that the more traditional malt whiskey had much more flavor, was a lower strength when it came out, and the remainder of the product that came out contained something called congeners, which is where all the flavor comes from whiskey. So the whiskey from the continuous still, while it was much less expensive to make, had much less flavor and often had been distilled even to over 95% ABV. So here's where the fight started, because people that were distilling this new type of whiskey out of grain, out of a continuous still, were making money hand over fist. But the people making malt whiskey, the more traditional way, felt that the grain whiskeys didn't have as much flavor and therefore shouldn't be Scotch whiskey. So they came to a compromise, and a lot of the categories we have now of Scotch or malt whiskey come from this fight that happened over 100 years ago. Now, both of these types of whiskey are still prevalent, and most commonly the two are mixed together, where the malt whiskey provides a lot of the flavor, but the grain whiskey keeps the price reasonable and also makes for an easier drinking product. So two examples we have in this case for this question are two products from Compass Box called Orchard House and Hedonism. Orchard House is a malt whiskey, and what you'll notice in Orchard House is lots of flavors of malt and notes of grain. It's very fruity, and it's very complex, and you'll notice it has a lot of body to it. Whereas Hedonism, being a grain whiskey, would be from whiskeys that were distilled to a much higher strength and therefore initially didn't have as much flavor inherently in them. However, Hedonism has been aged much longer in oak barrels, and because of that has taken on a lot of flavor of the barrel. So what you get is one whiskey with more flavor of grain and another with more flavor of wood. And when you taste them side by side, you can understand the difference of what those two ingredients bring to Scotch whiskey.